I think that the Scotch-Irish haven't been basically held under somebody's thumb for so many centuries. When they got here, it's like, nobody's gonna take it away from us this time. That's a driving force in our politics now, is people have basically gotten fed up with all this government intrusion and everything, and it's just like, you know, we want our freedoms back. We want to preserve our freedoms.
A lot of these mountain people, they kind of lived their lives based on what this country was founded on. God and freedom. If we can fall back to what our forefathers done, and that's work, and believe in something, and believe in each other, and move right on forward, I think things would flow out a whole lot smoother than everybody working against one another.
To many Americans, freedom and equality are the touchstones of their democracy. The 2016 presidential election tested those ideals and divided the nation. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton fought for the hearts and minds of Middle America, appealing to their fears and concerns, their values and their aspirations. But it was a speech by the outgoing President Barack Obama that caught the attention of a feature writer at the Washington Post, Frances Stead Sellers.
Barack Obama made this extraordinary speech before the Democratic National Convention. And Obama looked back to Americans' history in trying to persuade people to vote for Hillary Clinton, his successor, talking about the great values of the Constitution, the legal system in which this country is based. And in the middle of it, he suddenly talked about his Scots-Irish grandparents.
See, my grandparents, they came from the heartland. Their ancestors began settling there about 200 years ago. They were Scotch-Irish mostly. And my grandparents explained that folks in these parts, they didn't like show-offs. They didn't admire braggarts or bullies. They didn't respect mean-spiritedness or folks who were always looking for shortcuts in life. Come on now. Instead, what they valued were traits like honesty and hard work.
The Scotch-Irish are as diverse in their views and politics as anyone else in America. But when Barack Obama spoke about the values of his Scotch-Irish grandparents, it was a direct appeal to former Democrats thinking of voting for Trump, particularly the people of the Rust Belt and Appalachian Mountains, many of whom can trace their roots to Ulster and the people we call the Ulster Scots.
People had been talking about a Southern vote, but there wasn't very much awareness of Scots-Irish as a cultural identity. Very few people self-identify as Scots-Irish or have done historically in census, but they represent, or their cultural footprint is enormous, and one that I think Donald Trump realized he could play into.
Trump became one of us, and the greatest tool that you can have in politics is if you can establish yourself as us versus them. And people are hurting. They really are, with the loss of jobs, and they're looking at the way we were. It's what they're looking at, and they want those good times to come back. Democrats go after class, Republicans go after culture, and culture wins every time. Well, I'll be talking to people, and I ask them about their ethnicity, and they say, well, I'm English, or some German or whatever. And, everybody here that's lived here for any length of time has Scots-Irish genes. And it's just strange that we've never grasped as a country the power of this culture. much less identified.
To some degree, there is truth in the idea that the Scotch-Irish have lost their identity in a broader American character. When I'm talking with people, often with a group of students, I'll ask them, how do they identify themselves ethnically? And to be Scotch-Irish is very common. Then I'll ask them, what does that mean, Scotch-Irish? And usually they think of, well, somewhere, a grandparent or great-grandparent, one came from Ireland, the other came from Scotland, and they married, and then all their children became Scotch-Irish. Well, of course, that is far from the actual history of these people. But it does speak to that idea that we no longer have a firm grasp of who these people are.
The Scots-Irish are very much part of the American frontier tradition. And they were the Davy Crockett's, the people who were able to take America into the West. That's very much part of America's founding mythology and has been maintained so. But again, very often without the term Scots-Irish attached to it.
This is a culture that has almost become invisible. And yet, if you look at what the Scotch-Irish did, the lasting contributions they've made, you see it everywhere. You don't see it in self-identification, I'm Scotch-Irish. You see it in the traditions in the American military. You see it in country music, which came right out of the Ulster migration. You see it, most importantly, in the form of government that Andrew Jackson and people who succeeded him in office brought what we call frontier democracy, which actually came right out of the Scottish Kirk.
Donald Trump may not be aware of the 7th president's roots in Ulster, but it's no coincidence that a portrait of the original populist president, Andrew Jackson, now hangs on the wall of the Oval Office. Few Americans are aware of the part the Scotch-Irish have played in their nation's politics. But at a time when the future of the colonies was at stake, when British rule was overthrown and the new republic created, people from Ulster incited revolution, fought for independence, and influenced the very foundations of American democracy.
Well, the Scotch-Irish, of course, are one of the most important and impactful 18th century migration groups. And the term that we use for them varies. Sometimes Scots-Irish, Scotch-Irish, Ulster Scots, Irish, Irish Presbyterians.
You're talking now about a movement of people that's massive by early modern standards. So outside of course, the number of people who have been leaving Africa and heading in chains over to the New World, when it comes to the 18th century anyway, the Irish leaving are going to probably be the largest non-African group that's going to be sailing to what will be the American colonies.
Ulster Scots' migration to America began in the 1600s, but in the summer of 1718, more than 19 ships arrived in the port of Boston. Those on board were mainly Presbyterians, Ulster Scots farming families who had suffered religious discrimination and economic hardship, pursuing their dream of a better life in the New World.
As they say in mystery dramas, means, motive, and opportunity. There was a way for people to leave, and given the exigencies of life in Ulster, the economic opportunities in the Americas, they took it. That economic opportunity being that all-important four-letter word, land. Land ownership was a means to independence. not having to be subservient to a landlord, being able to stand on their own and to bequeath something to their children.
But there was a price to pay. While there was plenty of cheap land, it was on the frontier, the disputed hinterland between European settlement and Native American homelands. It was remote and often dangerous. And those who settled there had to be strong, resilient, and self-reliant.
They would look to live near one another for emotional support, economic support, and for spiritual support. It's been said that one can trace the movement of these newcomers from the north of Ireland by plotting the location of Presbyterian churches. It was part of their sense of community. They sought out people to whom they were related, or people they knew back in Antrim or Down or Donegal.
We know quite a bit about the communities that the Scotch-Irish created, often on emerging and ever westward moving frontiers, but beginning with central Pennsylvania, around Donegal Springs, or as migration pushed westward in Pennsylvania toward the time of the American Revolution, many of the Scotch-Irish took advantages of initiatives created by the governments of colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas, by offering land at very attractive prices. So they made a left turn, and they went south, and they went up the Shenandoah Valley. They'd have neighbors of other ethnic groups. Often an Irish family had a German neighbor. Over time, the Irish tended to marry each other, and the Germans tended to marry each other. So their ethnic identity was maintained over 2-3 generations.
Anne McClung farms in a part of Virginia once known as the Irish Tract, after the Ulster immigrants who settled here over 250 years ago.
It was first owned by McGuffins, and then Kirkpatrick's, and then the McClungs. It came down what they call the Great Wagon Road, and many of them, and particularly the McClungs, stopped in the Timber Ridge area, which is just north of Lexington.
Anne has a particular interest in the history of the log cabins built by those early settlers.
The cabins are all, I just think they're beautiful. They're all different. The Scots-Irish had very few building skills when they came here, and when they first were in the Philadelphia area, that's where they learned what they learned. They learned from the Swedes and the Germans how to put log houses together. And then they sort of developed their own techniques. So each log cabin is different. The logs are notched differently. Different types of logs are used. Some of them are just one room, one story. Some of them have chimneys in the center, which would be a German influence. Some of them have chimneys on either end of the cabin, which would be more of the Swedish influence. The original settlers and their families who have stayed here for generations are truly tied to this land, and all of them have that farming blood in them. It took guts, I'm sure. They seem to have this determination from what I've read, and the families work together. Even though they weren't close together, each family was pretty well isolated. They helped each other. They could put up a log structure in a day with other people helping and raising barns the same way. I think the Scots-Irish are totally responsible for settling our area, for giving us Lexington, our county seat, for establishing the churches and the schools, and without them, we wouldn't be here. We would have nothing.
By the 1770s, Scotch-Irish Presbyterian communities were thriving throughout the colonies, and they and the churches and schools they founded were to play a significant role in the movement towards American independence from Britain. As their numbers increased, so did the need for ministers. Many who answered that call came from the north of Ireland.
Among them was Francis Allison, who was very influential in training not just ministers for the Presbyterian ministry, but also men who would become leaders in the Revolution.
The son of a weaver from Donegal, Francis Allison instilled in his students a Presbyterian worldview in which all men were created equal, with a history of dissent dating back to the Scottish Reformation of the 1500s. He was also teaching the radical moral philosophy of another Ulster Presbyterian minister and leader of the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson. His ideas would change the way we view the world.
Francis Hutcheson is emblematic of a broader shift in understanding about what a human person is. And this broader shift was also something that transfixed so-called founding fathers at the time of the American Revolution. He comes up with the idea of the common sense of the moral sense, and that is we almost have a sixth sense as opposed to the five senses. And this sixth sense is one that allows us to appreciate others and makes us altruistic as opposed to just kind of greedy and individualistic in lots of ways. Now, to our ears, this doesn't sound too radical, but when you talk about the 17th or 18th century, this is sort of an earth-shattering idea.
Hutcheson had created a new political and social vision in which all human beings were born free and equal, and had as its goal liberty and happiness for all. This was at the heart of Francis Allison's teaching, and the inspiration for Americans about to cut their ties with Britain.
How and why do we break away from this? Do we turn our back on this? Surely there has to be some well thought out path to separation. The ideas of Allison who's again mediating, Francis Hutcheson, help provide direction.
If Francis Allison and Francis Hutcheson provided a blueprint for colonial leaders seeking independence, another Ulster Presbyterian would play a crucial role in sowing the seeds of revolutionary thought among the ordinary people.
We had another movement with William Tennant and his son Gilbert Tennant. William Tennant started what his detractors snubbingly called the Log College, which was an academy in the Scottish version to train young men for ministry, about 18 of whom would become leaders in what we call the Great Awakening.
How you doing? You doing it better?
Among them was his son Gilbert Tennant, who became one of the most famous preachers in the Americas. The Great Awakening was an emphasis away from intellectual learning, as Francis Allison promoted, towards a more emotional connection with your faith. So there was this belief that conversion came from an emotional experience and began with the heart instead of with the mind.
The young people and those people on the margins are the ones who are kind of transfixed with this new religiosity. And these were the people who flocked to hear people like Gilbert Tennant preach.
He's saying, come and follow me. I don't care what you did, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do.
Imagine a preacher coming to town. You've heard his name, you've perhaps read his sermons in pamphlet series, and he comes to town. He can't preach in a church because he's not welcome in the church, so he finds the square outside the church or the town square, somewhere else to set up.
But if this church is going to be built, and if we're going to win this county and win this city, it is not going to be by me, it's going to be by you.
Crowds gathered to hear these sermons, which would be 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours long. They told stories that connected where people were in their lives. And there was excitement, a carnival atmosphere.
Gilbert Tennant was not only preaching revival to the masses, he was telling them that only men who'd experienced their own spiritual conversion should be ministers.
When we hear these things, we don't think much of it, but in the 18th century, this is dynamite to be able to say something like that. This is such an explosive kind of concept because it's telling people that individually they can determine things on their own. So it's ironic. So if you will, kind of the first sort of youth rebellion is based upon religion.
This religious revolution would have profound political consequences.
Americans are going to take the old skins of religious revival and fill them, if you will, with the new wine of liberty. But the idea of kind of standing up for yourself, this is something that would have resonated with them in many ways.
Both the emotionalism of evangelical Protestantism preached by Gilbert Tennant and the reasoned ideals associated with Francis Hutcheson and the Enlightenment played important roles in the American Revolution. But it was economic and political grievances that would ignite the revolutionary fire.
I don't think that the revolution itself was inevitable. There was absolutely a reckoning that had to happen. The colonies were getting larger, they were getting fuller of their own self-importance. They really viewed themselves as sort of adult, mature societies, and Great Britain really didn't. And so there was going to be some conflict there.
That conflict began when the British Crown imposed a series of taxes on the colonies in order to recoup the money it had spent fighting a war against France. Each new tax on sugar, tea, glass and paper fueled resentment in America, so that for the first time the colonies came together to act as one in protest.
The Continental Congress was the effort by the political leaders to really harness the excitement of the revolution and the possibility of resistance and come up with one unified body that would be able to speak for all 13 states. They came together in Philadelphia in 1774, and the purpose was really to build ties between these delegates. The states didn't have all that much in common. They had different religions and ethnicities and government structures, and they didn't have any reason to trust one another. They were embarking on this enormous adventure of requesting reform from the king and potentially going farther.
Community leaders across the colonies were also considering their position. In 1775, a full year before the Declaration of Independence, the Scotch-Irish Covenanters of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, published the Mecklenburg Resolves.
When word comes from the Continental Congress that local communities are to organize local committees that will functionally oversee the political life of these communities in the midst of this rebellion, whatever this rebellion is going to be and wherever it's going, the residents of Charlotte take this quite a bit further than everyone else is ready to go. They gather and declare the laws of the British Empire null and void in the backcountry and proclaim their allegiance to the provincial government in the coast and then by default to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress is. They do that, though, because they come into that room with a lot of cultural baggage that has been remarkably durable. They believe their forefathers, dating back to 1638 in the Scottish National Covenant, in 1643 in the Solemn League and Covenant, their ancestors who fought at Derry and Enniskillen, they bring with them the assumption that our families have done this type of thing before. We are used to resisting the tyranny of the crown against our personal liberty and our religious liberty. And here we are in our generation to do it yet again. So from their perspective, it makes perfect sense to say the British Crown has yet again voided its authority over us, and we will create a new authority.
Yet politicians in Philadelphia were wary of Ulster Presbyterians, particularly the Covenanters of the Carolina backcountry.
When you talk about Presbyterians in the 18th century, especially when you talk about Presbyterians in the backcountry, most people in polite circles would have rolled their eyes and known what you meant. What you really mean is a certain type of political radical who has a fierce independence, a rather rugged localism, and is carrying with them the political heritage of the Covenanting tradition that dates back well over 150 years at this point. They're very likely to be rebellious. They're very likely to find everyone to be acting in a tyrannical way towards them. And they're very likely to fight back when they see it. The Mecklenburg Resolves in May of 1775 do call for the area militias to pick up arms and be ready for what's likely to be a military conflict. But that's one community, and they don't speak for all the backcountry communities. What's hard to tell from Philadelphia or New Bern is not whether or not backcountry Presbyterian communities are going to rise up in arms against tyranny. It's who are they going to say is being tyrannical.
The Continental Congress enlisted the help of influential Scotch-Irish minister David Caldwell.
Caldwell puts together a sermon titled The Character and Doom of the Sluggard, taken from a verse in Proverbs that says, those who aren't willing to stand up for themselves are bound to pay tribute to foreign leaders. It's that sermon, both as Caldwell preaches it at multiple locations and in print, that becomes wildly popular to motivate many backcountry communities to en masse support the rebellion.
The influence of the Scotch-Irish in the fight for American independence was far-reaching. In Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, Scotch-Irish communities drew up their own statements of dissent against the Crown. Philadelphia, America's largest city in 1776, was run by Scotch-Irish Presbyterians.
During the American Revolution, a revolution occurred within Pennsylvania as Irish Presbyterians in coalition with German Reformed, two prominent groups in the province who'd been shut out of power, actually took power and maintained power by shutting out their opponents. Those Quakers and those Anglicans who are suspected of being, shall we say, less than enthusiastic about the revolution were denied the right to be part of the polity. So now the Scotch-Irish are in control of the government in Philadelphia. They run the state.
With pro-rebellion Scotch-Irish in power in Pennsylvania, the way was clear for all the colonies to agree to a declaration of independence from Britain.
The Declaration of Independence takes place in the summer of 1776, and the purpose is really to list the grievances that the states had against King George III and against Parliament, and explain why they were taking these big, drastic steps, explain why they were going to war.
3 of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were born in Ulster. Several of the signatories had been students of Ulster Presbyterian minister Francis Allison. Among them was the secretary of the Continental Congress and a leader of the revolutionary movement, Charles Thomson from County Londonderry.
In signing their names on the document, they were pledging to each other, they were pledging to their families and their communities that they were committed to this path and were willing to risk everything, their lives, their land, their families, in pursuit of this new goal.
If Francis Allison influenced men who signed the Declaration of Independence, some of the key ideas enshrined within it can be traced to the Scottish Enlightenment and Francis Hutcheson.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, those words have transfixed people since they were written in 1776. Many would say that it has a lot to do with kind of Scottish Enlightenment ideas about what makes a person and about the Scottish moral sense, that all people are inclined to sociability, all people are inclined to make links with one another, and all people can essentially be good. It's this great kind of vision of hope, if you will, that the Declaration of Independence is premised upon, and also owes a great deal to the Scottish Enlightenment.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those inalienable rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence, are as important to Americans today as the day they were written.
People will move for more freedom, more or less taxes, or to be with people that share the same viewpoint that they share, whatever the case is. A lot of the Scots-Irish tended to move into the wilderness and were more adventurous than some of the other people that came over. I think that spirit of independence is still in a lot of us younger ones, even though we don't really realize where it came from. I think it makes us a lot more independent as far as our views of government. And we want less government intrusion and be independent as much as we possibly can. And I think that's a big reason why we came over here in the first place.
Billy Walker grew up in an area of the Blue Ridge Mountains settled by immigrants from Ulster.
This little bit of water here is called Chestnut Run Branch. And Chestnut Mountain is back up here. And Granddaddy used to live up on the side of the mountain. He was born back there. And this used to be an old school. And he went here until he was 12 years old. And actually, a lot of what you see here, a lot of these trees, of course, they're all under 100 years old, but at one time, these mountains were cleared off, and there were tomato plantations back here, and apple orchards, and they had their own brand, and I mean, it was a whole lot more than what people realize. People coming here, I mean, there was nothing. When they came back to an area like this, the first thing they had to do was to build some kind of a shelter, you know. And then the second thing, they would build a church. And the third thing would be a school. The Scots-Irish were very education-oriented, and all through the mountains, you can find little foundations or whatever. And I remember seeing more when I was a kid of little schools here and there. And, you know, they were like within walking distance of little small communities. It's like, oh, you know, ignorant hillbillies live back in the sticks and, you know, can't read or write or anything. And That's not the case at all. They were very determined to get an education and better themselves.
Change came to these communities in the aftermath of World War I and during the Great Depression of the 1930s, as the government offered incentives for families to relocate and designated parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains a national park.
I used to hear stories when I was a kid about how the government would come in and load up people on a truck. And before they had even left the farm, had set the cabin on fire so they could not come back in here. And now, where all these people used to live in all these little communities, now it's like national forest.
It was Scotch-Irish communities like these that had done so much to win American independence and safeguard its freedoms.
Well, they had massive influence. But again, we often will look, well, who are the signers of the Declaration of Independence? Who are going to play those prominent roles? When we look for those people, we miss, I think, the real story there. And the real story is that almost to a person, so many of these immigrants and the descendants of these immigrants are going to be on the patriot side at the time of the American Revolution. So much so that an historian has written that perhaps we should think about the American Revolution as an Irish revolution in America.
Some say as high as 60% of the Revolutionary War army were the Scotch-Irish. Good 6 of my ancestors. One of the great battles, which is underreported, let's say, in the Revolutionary War, was the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I had 3 direct ancestors fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain.
That battle was the inspiration for Robert Inman's play, Liberty Mountain.
Walter Mackenzie, minister of the Presbyterian faith, servant of God and my Scots-Irish flock. It all is a thread about how the Scots-Irish changed America, and they did. I think the Scots-Irish saved America. I honor my father and our proud heritage, but I also feel a strong bond with our new home. It is the place of my future, where I will someday marry and raise my own family, free and independent. I am, sir, a Scots-Irish American. It was primarily Scots-Irish who fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, started by the Over Mountain men who lived in what was then western North Carolina across the Blue Ridge Mountains. And they were the ones who organized the Patriot force that defeated the Loyalists at Kings Mountain. And it turned the tide of the war. The British were winning up to then, especially in the South. They had captured Charleston, subdued South Carolina, they had captured Charlotte, North Carolina, and preparing to move north.
Leading the British forces as they moved north through the Carolinas was Scotsman Colonel Patrick Ferguson.
Ferguson sent a letter to the leaders of the Over Mountain men, and he said, if you do not lay down your arms and pledge allegiance to the king, I will march my army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste to your country with fire and sword. Well, you just don't threaten those Scots-Irish Presbyterians living over there in Appalachia. That was the trigger, and they sent out the word to organize militia units to join them, and then they marched. The Over Mountain men were not trained militia. They were Indian fighters. They had learned the tactics of battle fighting Indians.
Gathering men as they went, the militia marched across the mountains, and on the 7th of October 1780, they found Ferguson and his men camped at the top of Kings Mountain, North Carolina.
They took Ferguson by surprise. They attacked up the mountain. Ferguson's men on top were trained in standard British battlefield tactics, where you march in big rows of men in ranks, fire in massive volleys, and then charge with bayonets. But this was a wooded mountainside, and their fire went over the heads of the Patriots. The Patriots had long rifles which were extremely accurate, and they could hide in the underbrush and behind the trees and rocks and pick off these loyalists one by one up on the crest. It took only an hour. It was savage hand-to-hand combat. Almost 200 of the loyalists were killed, only 28 of the Patriots. The Patriot force dispersed. Most of them went back to their homes and families, and that's why they fought. They were fighting not for some ideal of the America of the future, but they were fighting for their land, their homes, their families, their neighbors, their friends. And I think that's why they were successful. They were driven by the need to protect what they had achieved in America. It was an improbable event, but just imagine what history would have been like had the Patriots not won, and won decisively at Kings Mountain. As I like to tell audiences in the U.S., if it weren't for Kings Mountain, we would probably all be singing God Save the Queen.
Within a year, the war had been won, and America had gained its independence from Britain. But what the new United States would look like, what form of government it would adopt, was far from certain.
The 1780s, as they were figuring out the Constitution and what was going to happen next, was an incredibly tense time. There was a new nation, and it was a republic, and all republics in history had failed prior to this one. There was this tremendous anxiety that this new nation was going to fall apart. And there was a lot of tension about what the new system should look like. They had just fought a war and a revolution to get rid of a monarchy. They were trying to find a middle ground that gave enough executive power and enough federal power to the government to give them security and give them sort of a strong international voice in diplomacy, and to be able to raise money so that the nation had credit, but to also reserve powers to the states and to reserve rights for individuals.
The Constitution was devised by men sitting in a hall in Philadelphia in August with the doors closed and the windows closed because they were meeting in secret. They had no mandate to create an entirely new frame of government, and yet they did. And when this was presented to the Pennsylvania legislature, the reaction from those from the back country, mostly of Ulster origin, was extremely negative. Here's what was missing from the Constitution. The portion of the Constitution that Americans hold dear is particularly the Bill of Rights. There was no Bill of Rights. When asked about a Bill of Rights, the framers of the Constitution said, "Oh, you don't need that, trust us, you'll be fine."
But the Scotch-Irish in Pennsylvania, led by John Smiley, Robert Whitehill, and William Finlay, were among those who insisted that if there was to be a constitution, then it had to include the people's rights to liberty of conscience, freedom of speech, trial by jury, and the right to bear arms.
William Finlay said, "I can think of no better device to create an aristocracy than this Constitution." Finlay and Smiley and Whitehill were speaking from their experience, both in the backcountry and the frontier of Pennsylvania, but also, in the case of Finley and Smiley, of having grown up in Ulster. They saw their fathers paying rent to landlords. They saw their families suffering to come up with the wherewithal to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland. They did not want to see an aristocracy and an established church in the United States. That's why they were so insistent on a Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution.
Once a Bill of Rights had been agreed, the Constitution was finally ratified in June 1788. But within 3 years, the federal government faced the first major challenge to its authority. And it came from the Scotch-Irish communities of Western Pennsylvania. In order to reduce the national debt and pay back bondholders who'd financed the Revolutionary War, Congress passed an excise tax on whiskey.
To the well-to-do in Philadelphia, this made perfect sense. Whiskey's being produced, let the producers of whiskey pay the tax. Well, from the perspective of Western Pennsylvania and Kentucky and the hills of the Carolinas, there are a few very serious problems with this.
While there were a few commercial whiskey producers, in the Scotch-Irish communities of the back country, distilling was a part-time occupation and part of the culture.
Whiskey was something that people routinely had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No social gathering was complete without passing the jug around. Whiskey was an integral part of daily life. And so to have this tax imposed on a people who couldn't pay was a terrible affront, and it seemed very wrong.
When revenue officials tried to collect the tax, they were met first with passive resistance and then physical attack. Things came to a head in 1794 when federal troops put down an insurrection led by County Tyrone man James McFarlane. It was the threat of more military action led by the President George Washington that finally ended the rebellion. But it didn't end whiskey making. Chris Prilliman grew up in an area famed for making moonshine.
A lot of these old folks in these mountains, you know, I mean, it just wasn't where they could go out and see the world, so they had to find their entertainment right in there amongst where they was at, you know. A lot of them was bootleggers and stuff, and they'd have corn shuckings, and I've heard them talk about back in the old days, they'd pull all the furniture to the walls of the house, you know, and then they'd have a square dance in the house. That's one thing that got me so interested in the liquor business. When I was little, all them people that I respected, they had their little business on the side, and it was little sneaky doings, you know, and they'd always have to sneak around the corner and get them a little drink. They'd have their selected stuff, you know, whether it be some good corn liquor or brandy, but they'd go around the building and share a drink with somebody that was trusted, you know. I just got fascinated by that way of life when I was just a little bitty, because there's a lot of people into it that I looked up to, so. And that's how I wound up wanting to play music and wound up fooling Flicker too.
The Ulster Scots migration to America continued through the 18th and into the 19th century, as settlers and their descendants pushed west across the continent. They continued to influence what was still a fledgling democracy, But there was one man in particular who arguably did more to shape the modern American presidency than any other. Andrew Jackson had been born within months of his parents arriving in America from Carrickfergus. His upbringing in the Carolina backcountry was typical of many Ulster immigrants. But the life he went on to lead was very different to his Scotch-Irish compatriots.
Jackson becomes, in essence, the greatest success story of the Scotch-Irish experience in its post-revolutionary years, despite the fact that he's actually not that representative of most Scotch-Irish backcountry people. He becomes a merchant, he becomes a large farmer and a slaveholder, and is wildly successful in all these things. Most Scotch-Irish Presbyterians did not have those paths to wealth that they could or did take quite so easily. They tend to be much smaller farmers. But in Jackson, they see themselves, and they see someone who carries along their heritage. And he becomes a kind of political hero in many ways, a caricature of what every Scotch-Irish in the backcountry wishes they could themselves become.
Andrew Jackson became president in 1828 after a bitter, nasty campaign. The Washington establishment hated him, but he won the election on a wave of support for his populist policies and image as a man of the people.
Jackson's a complicated legacy because he is the Janus-faced aspect of the Scotch-Irish experience. Proudly independent, adventurous, willing to carve out of very rough territory, vibrant and successful communities, and at the same time doing that on the backs of clearing out other people from those communities, and very quickly accepting that to do this most effectively, the way we will do it is to own other people whose skin looks different than ours.
Jackson created the presidency as we know it today. He founded the Democratic Party, and he took on the banks and political establishment. But more recently, it's for his role as a slave owner and for the forced removal of Native Americans from their land to make way for white farmers that he has been remembered.
Andrew Jackson is really getting a bad rap these days. You know, he was a remarkable president. He brought to this country the notion that you take care of the people at the bottom and they will do great things. That was frontier-style democracy. And people were, you know, very threatened by the fact that he became president, but he changed the face of American politics. You know, was he perfect? Was anybody perfect? Can we all be judged during the time we live, you know, 200 years from now? But he was a great president.
And it is Andrew Jackson's anti-establishment populist persona that appeals to Donald Trump.
It was during the Revolution that Jackson first confronted and defied an arrogant elite. Does that sound familiar to you? I wonder why they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. Oh, I know the feeling, Andrew.
If you look at, you know, Donald Trump's election in 2016, and people wonder, you know, how he came to areas like this and sold, you know, the way he did. I mean, you can go back to Andy Jackson, you know, for that. And of course, Andy Jackson was the first people's president, and his populism, you know, led in the formation of the modern Democratic Party. And it's a cultural thing. We're populist. We believe in the people. We believe that the democracy is threatened, you know, when we don't have social justice and economic fairness for all people.
He didn't want government corruption. He expanded benefits for veterans. He battled the centralized financial power that brought influence at our citizens' expense. He imposed tariffs on foreign countries to protect American workers. That sounds very familiar. Wait till you see what's going to be happening pretty soon, folks.
I think if anybody wants to emulate Andrew Jackson, there's not a bad thing in it.
There have been more than a dozen American presidents with Ulster Scots roots. But only Andrew Jackson had an era named after him. For many people, the ideals of Jacksonian democracy, social justice, economic fairness, and individual liberty were central to the presidential election of 2016.
I think what 2016 showed was that the white Southern vote had a cultural footprint, that this was a Scots-Irish footprint. Going ahead, we'll find out whether that identity plays out in 2018 and more so in 2020.
There's no doubt that many of those voters courted by politicians in the 2016 presidential election identify as Scotch-Irish. But the descendants of immigrants from Ulster are to be found in every part of the United States and right across the political and social spectrum. Who they are, the part they played in America's history, is often lost in the founding myths of America. But the Ulster Scots were critical to the success of the War of Independence. They helped secure the individual freedoms outlined in the Bill of Rights. And they played a significant part in shaping the democracy of the new republic and the cultural and spiritual life of the United States.
The Presbyterian Church today in the United States is only about 1 million members, so our influence has diminished. But our ideas and our values have informed the culture of the United States in many ways. One, education, because we started so many schools and put so much value in education, and in particularly in public education. Also important is this idea of the corruptibility of power. The tendency to be suspicious of those in power, I think, is related to those beliefs that the Presbyterians brought over. That continues to this day.
Part of the legacy is the way in which Scotch-Irishness plays out in the current population and the large numbers of people who do identify themselves as Scotch-Irish.
It's the dominant culture in blue-collar America. The culture, not necessarily just the ethnic group itself. Bottom up. Everything about the Scotch-Irish coming out of the Scottish Kirk, I'm your equal. You may make more money, you may be my commanding officer. Humanly, in human terms, I'm your equal. That's the basis of the Scotch-Irish culture.
When the man comes down your way, Lord, the man comes down your way, the devil's gotta get paid. When the man comes down your way.